Cassell, and I'm here at the Van Hoosen Farm Museum in Rochester Hills to talk a little bit about Michigan's first heavy industry, logging. First tool I'd like to show you was used by surveyors. When Michigan became a state in 1837, we had to grid the state so that people knew what piece of property they were buying and what they weren't. This little tool here is called a race knife. It has a little movable blade on it. The end of it is J-shaped, so when you use it against a piece of wood, it cuts out a little groove like cutting a lemon peel. That folds out of the way to reveal another blade which is fixed to a point. And these two blades are used in conjunction by the surveyor when he comes to a section corner where four sections come together. They would cut the bark off a tree, giving them a little window of wood. They bend the little movable blade up and they can cut all their straight lines, sevens, ones, that sort of thing with that blade. Then move it out of the way, and using the point, this is a fixed point, this is the blade, they could put the point into the wood and then revolve it around that point to cut threes, zeros, that sort of thing. Called a race knife, and surveying was the first thing you had to do in Michigan before you could sell the land. Logging companies that wanted to cut timber would originally buy 40-acre sections of wood, and they'd go in there with what they called swampers or timber cruisers. The timber cruisers were people who walked the land, made notes on which sections were worth logging and which ones weren't, and they would give that information to the logging companies. They were probably the highest paid individuals in the logging business because all their success depended on what land you bought. Land had to be near rivers at that time because they had no other way of moving the big logs. When you started cutting, the first thing you would do is get yourself, well, a little camp set up. You'd have there would be number 6 or 7 major buildings. It would be a saw shop for filing saws, a blacksmith shop. You'd have a bunkhouse, a cook shed, an office, and a storage building for hay and that sort of thing. And you'd have a stable for your horses, your oxen, whatever you were using to move the logs. And moving everything back then was done not by steam locomotives or cars. It was all done by horses and mules and oxen. We have here are a set of ox shoes. These little shoes here went on an ox. An ox has a cloven hoof, and a cloven hoof is to be shot on both sides so that the articulated hoof can move on uneven ground without twisting their ankle. Oxen were very good for pulling logs out of the woods, not as fast as horses on the roads. So everything had its place. This shoe is a little bit different from the horseshoe, regular horseshoe. We're all familiar with that, but you can see the difference. A mule actually has a narrower hoof. Narrower hoof is better in uneven ground, won't be twisted so easily. Every logging camp had a corral full of horses that were healing up from twisting their ankle or what they called caulking themselves. In the winter, shoes had large spikes on them so they could walk on iced roads, and they had a habit of stepping on their own feet and cutting themselves, called caulking. So there were advantages and disadvantages to the different animals that they used for pulling logs. When you opened a logging camp, you would typically send in a team of guys called swampers, and they would make the roads for the camp. Their job was cutting through the woods and making a serviceable road that went around the hills rather than up and down, because again, it's hard to move with nothing but horses. So you'd go into there and you would cut whatever wood you had to cut to move the trees out of the way. You'd set up the camp. All those different buildings had to be built. And when you were ready to cut wood, You would get a team of people in there. A lot of times the people that did the logging were farmers who weren't busy in the winter, because most of the cutting was all done in the winter, where you could use the iced roads to skid the logs. In the evening, they would take a wagon load full of water and run that over the roads to form an iced surface. Then they had a separate sleigh-like object that would cut 2 grooves in that ice in order for the runners of the sleighs to follow the road. If you were pulling logs down hills, that sort of thing, you'd have a man called the sandman. His job was to constantly adjust the slope with sand or snow, depending on how well the wagon was moving. Sandman was very important. If you had a hill that was too steep and you still had to go down it, you'd hook a cable to that sleigh and you would ease that sleigh downhill so it didn't overrun the horses. When your camp is set up and you're ready to cut timber, the men would have a huge breakfast in the morning because they had to work on that for a sun-up to sundown day. It's a long day and a lot of hard work, nothing but hard work. They would go into the woods typically with what they called a single-bitted pole axe. The name pole axe comes from the weight at the back of the axe, which is called a pole. And that was what they originally cut the trees down with. So you would take 2 of these into the woods in the morning, because you didn't go back to the camp until evening. They would bring out your lunch to you in the woods. By noon, you had dulled the first axe. You'd put that aside, you'd take your second axe, and you'd chop with that until evening. Later on, somebody got clever, decided, why don't we put the blade on both ends of the axe? And they came up with this, the double-bitted axe, which was used from then on. You'd cut all morning with one side, in the afternoon you'd cut with the other. While you're cutting, somebody noticed that the trees, once they were down, would be cut up with what they called a bucking or cross-cut saw. I can show you one of those here. This is a typical crosscut or bucking saw. This is used on the log once it's fallen. If it's horizontal, it can be applied to the wood. The handles are mounted on top because the tree is typically laying on the ground. If the tree were laying over a ditch and you had to cut it while you were standing in the ditch, it would be pretty hard to cut because the handles are on the wrong side. The handles on the bucking saw can easily be removed by simply revolving them and taking them off. The reason for doing this is if the tree were up above and you're standing in a valley, you could then put the saw handle on this way. The saw would now be mounted like so. You could much more easily cut into it when it's up at the top. Later on, somebody got the bright idea of making a special saw for cutting the tree down. This is called a felling saw, and you'll notice the difference in the handle configuration. We now have one hand right in line with the blade, the other hand is offset, and it's permanently affixed to the blade. You can't easily take it off because you have no reason to. This saw is used horizontally to cut the tree down. It's also made with a thinner cross section so that the sawyer can get his wedges in behind that saw as soon as he's deep enough into the tree. These wedges are used to keep the tree from pinching the saw blade. Another tool that the loggers would take in with them in the morning was a little bottle of kerosene. The reason for the kerosene was while you're cutting a pine tree, you're getting a lot of sap on the blade. The sap is sticky, and in order to keep that from causing too much friction, they would splash that kerosene on the saw blade to keep it lubricated and to keep that sap from causing a problem. The saws had to be maintained. One building we mentioned, that was the sawyer's sharpening building, would have somebody in there that knew what they were doing on these saws. They would use a vise like this. This was clamped to the table. The saw was mounted in the vise, and they used a gauge like this to file the teeth of that saw. This gauge is made so that you can actually bend that file to match the radius of the teeth on the saw. It has little fingers on either side that support the back of the file and a screw in front that actually causes the file to bend until it matches the radius of the teeth. Then it would be run up and down the saw until you had a little bright spot on each cutting tooth. These are the cutting tooth, this is the raking tooth. And it's going to peel the wood out of that groove. It's always set about 9 thousandths deeper to make sure that both sides are cut before it contacts the wood. You'd file until you had a little show on each of the cutting teeth. Then you would file that tooth until that little bit of flat spot disappears. When you do that on every tooth, you're now ready to sharpen the raking tooth. You turn the tool around and you lay that on the saw so that the raking tooth, if I can get that right, the raking tooth will fit through this flat part of the filing jig. You take a file and you file right down to this part. That will leave the top of the raking tooth 9 thousandths of an inch below the cutters. And that's important so that you cut the wood on either side of the groove before this contacts the wood. The teeth are bent, and I'd like to show you how that's done. This other tool that the saw filer would use is a saw set. And what they mean by set is how far you bend the alternate cutting teeth. This would be set up in a vise. You would bend every left-hand tooth out the same distance. Then he would flip it around and he would bend every other tooth in order to get one tooth going to the right, one going to the left to cut each side of the groove, or kerf as it was called. All right, now we've cut our logs down and we've sawed them into lengths. The teamster is going to have to haul them out of the woods. He's probably going to use the oxen to haul them because they won't twist their ankles so easy and they pull harder than a horse. On the harness of his team, he's going to have a little hammer like this. It has a little snap hook on it. If he notices a snowball building up in the horse's hoof, then he will lift that horse's leg up, take this little hammer, chip out the snowball. He'll also look at that hoof at the same time and see if any of the nails are loosening up on that shoe. If they are, he has a hammer to reclinch that nail. When he's done with that, he'll put this back on the harness so it always travels with the wagon. If we're using horses or oxen to skid the logs out of the woods after they've been cut to length, they would use a big pair of what looks like ice tongs. These are skidding tongs. They'd be clamped onto the end of the log. Oxen or horses would be hooked to the big ring here, and that would be used to drag that log out to the tote road. This particular pair is interesting because the blacksmith has made the ring out of an old horseshoe. When we've cut those logs down and we've skidded them out to the road, we're then going to have to load them on the sleigh. These are big, heavy logs, and it's going to take a little derrick or horses to drag that log up. A set of logs that are laid perpendicular to the sleigh. Logs will be rolled up that set of logs and set on the sleigh. If they're using a derrick, they're going to have two hooks like this. A hook gets pounded into either end of the log. The derrick gets hold of the other end of the chains, and if you notice on that hook, there's a little ring on there which they would tie a rope to, and that rope is handled by an individual man on each end. He can pull on that rope and he can steer that log so they can set it down on the wagon properly. These are called loading hooks, and there are always a lot of those around. Once you've got the logs loaded on the sleigh, you're going to have a team of horses generally to pull them over to the riverbank. Logs were decked along the river in the wintertime and waited for spring before they went in the water. In the spring, everybody would push their logs into the water at the same time. All of them would be mixed up as they headed down the river. They had to be branded. This is a marking hammer used to brand the ends of those logs. If you look at this log section here, you can see the marks in it. It would be branded several times all the way around so that you could tell, no matter how it floated in the river, whose log that was. It was not too uncommon for river pirates to take their pike poles. That was a 15-foot long pole with an end on it that they could hook the log and pull it with, or they could push the log. This is a 15-foot long pole. They could grab a good log, pull it into the side of the river, take their crosscut saw, cut off the end of it, put their own company's mark on it, and push it back in the river. This was a common problem. The reason some of these survive nowadays is they would become covered with silt at the bottom of the river. And the silt is what they call anaerobic. There's no oxygen in it. And if there's no oxygen, bacteria can't live and it won't rot. So they still dredge these up when they work on bridges and that sort of thing. So at any rate, everything is decked along the river for springtime. And at that time, they'll be marked with the log marking hammer, and the scaler will come by with a ruler that's specially made for computing the amount of board feet they expect to get out of that log. It has a little hook end on it, and in this case it has 4 separate lengths of log. On the other side, 4 more lengths of log. So 8 different lengths of log can be measured with this same rule. If you have 16-foot logs, you would use, in this case, the second up from the bottom scale. It has numbers all along it that correspond with the diameter. And you would use that to measure the diameter. You know the length, and the scaler would record the amount of board feet they expect to get out of that log. Okay, this little book here was the logger's reference book. It had tables and information on how to do all kinds of different work in the logging industry. It was a handbook for loggers, and the scaler would use that to figure out his board foot estimates for his timber. Once they've been marked and scaled, they're ready to go in the river, and they would be pushed in the spring at the time when they felt the water was the highest and the most likely to carry those logs to the booming yard, where they would be assembled into rafts. Now, if you weren't cutting large timber, and if you were cutting smaller timber, you don't want to let anything go to waste. The other major product of the logging companies was railroad ties. Railroads were just coming into service in America, and millions of railroad ties were required to put those rails down. The way they would do it, a man would go into the woods with a one-man saw. These tie cutters generally worked alone. This would be the type of saw that they would use. If you had a partner, you had another handle out here he could use. Typically, it was used just by one man. It has the same tooth setup as any other crosscut saw. It's just not made for cutting as long or as wide a log as the heavy timber. If you're cutting railroad ties, you would cut the tree down that you selected. They would take and stand on top of that tree with a single or double bitted axe, and they would cut into the side of the tree. This is a little diagram, basically, of how they did that. They would stand on top, they would cut into the side of the tree to a line, and that would establish how much wood they were going to take off of it. They would then take the broad axe. This is a good example here. This is a little bigger than they would use for railroad ties, but this axe was used to plane the edge of that log smooth. Railroad companies would pay a premium for axe-cut railroad ties rather than saw-cut. If it was saw-cut in a mill, it would have a kind of a fuzzy surface that would hold water. Those ties rotted quicker, and the railroad companies would pay a premium to have a man actually square them by hand. If you look at the way this log is set up, there are two sleepers that would always stay in place. Log would be laid on there. In the case of heavier timber, usually not railroad ties, the dog that holds the log to the sleeper is shown here. This piece has little teeth on it so it won't come out, and that's pounded into what they call the sleeper that stays in place. The other piece is movable and can be knocked out and knocked back in, and that holds the log in place while it's being squared. Another little tool for the people that were doing the railroad ties called a picaroon. It had about a 3-foot handle on it. This one here is made out of an old double-bitted axe. Has a point on it, and that was used to simply dig into that tie so you could pick it up off the ground easily. Picaroon, also used in the sawmills for pulling scrap out of the way when it's cut off the saw. Railroad ties had to be marked as to who owned them, and this was a typical marking hammer, a little bit different than the log marking hammer. These ties were stacked, and they may be stacked unevenly, so it has a longer neck on it. That way you can mark each individual tie without having to worry about hitting the handle. So those were for tie marks, and the bigger, heavier ones were for heavy timber. The railroad ties typically were not skidded to the lakes unless you were in an area where there were no roads. They could be taken out by train. Little railroads were developed in the logging industry about 1876. I think the first one was a big success, and along one of those old road beds I found this piece of bronze. It's actually a bearing from a railroad car from one of the little logging roads, and you can see the hole that indicates where the axle had actually worn through the bearing and was rubbing against the iron that supported it, probably smoking and squealing like crazy. They changed this bearing right out in the woods and just threw it away. It was so successful in the first year. They had bad weather in the first year of railroading and the narrow gauge railroads for the logging companies. Hardly anybody could skid their wood to the rivers. The majority of wood that was put in the river that year was put in by the company that had the little railroad. So it was a big success and took off quite well. Another tool I didn't show is the hook. This is a tool used similar to the little picaroon for lifting railroad ties. You could hook it like a hay bale and pick it up. You can tell that this one is a little bit different than a hay hook because it has that type of point. Another tool, and actually another product of the tie making industry, was the bark. When they made ties, they cut them from hemlock or cedar, and the tanning industry used hemlock and cedar to make tannic acid for tanning hides. So they had a special tool to remove the bark from these logs before they cut them into ties. This is called a barking spud, and it was used against the log in this particular way to peel that bark off. Sections of bark would be cut to length. They would be stacked in bales, and they would be floated down the river to whoever was processing that. Now, that was another major product of the logging industry that we never hear about. Now, when the logs went in the river in the spring, they would be floated all together in a big mass, and they could easily pile up into what they called a log jam. The riverman's tool to break those jams up This one here went in the river, and it's rotted, the handle's rotted away, would have been about 5 foot long. Handle would have stood up about this long on the ground. Has a point on it. There's another tool that looks just like it called a cant hook that has a shoe, and that's used strictly for rolling logs on land. This tool would roll a log or could be used to push the log in the river, and this is called a peavey. Peavey has a point. The cant hook can't be a peavey because it doesn't have a point. That was the riverman's tool. When you're going down the river in the spring, it's super cold. You're in cold water all day. But they had a superstition that said that if they got dry, they would get pneumonia. So believe it or not, they actually slept in their clothing and dried the clothing right on them. Food during the day was always brought out to the loggers. They didn't go back to camp when they were cutting wood. They didn't go back to camp when they were on the river drive. On the river drive, they had a little shack that was on a raft, and that was called a wanigan, and it traveled with them. Any food they needed would be provided right on the spot. When they got down to the what they called the booming yard, or the mouth of the river, the logs had to be sorted according to their brand. All the brand of one log would be assembled into a raft like fingers. A rope would be laid across those logs, and that rope would be stapled to the logs with what they called a rafting pin. These rafting pins are still recovered out of the river from time to time, because if they get in the anaerobic silt, they don't rot. This is an old pin, but it's still in great shape. These were always made of wood, hard wood that would pound right into that soft pine. They would be pounded in like so. The rope would tie all the logs together. When that was assembled, they would be sent down to the sawmill that was cutting their lumber. Always made of wood, because if one of these went into the mill by mistake, it wouldn't ruin the saw blade. When you're putting a raft together, you're using rope to tie the logs together. This oddball tool came from the booming yards. It was used as a rope cutter. It would be laid on the rope, hit with a heavy hammer, and that would cut the rope immediately. If you weren't using rope and you were making a big raft that would be going down the lakes, typically those would be tied together by heavy chain. Every logging company spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on rope and chain to hold those rafts together. If you were going to ship your logs on the lake rather than on the rivers, to keep them together, they would typically take logs and they would pound them together end to end with what they call log dogs. These are chain dogs. This is a ring dog. Did the same purpose. A chain would be put through the ring to tie the two logs together. When you had a long enough chain of logs, you would surround the saw logs that were going to the mill, and they would be pulled to the mill with a tugboat or a schooner. When you're working the logs in the river, you want to make sure you don't fall off. In order to do that, the river hogs, which they were called, would wear boots that they called corked or caulked. And what they meant by that is it had spikes on the bottom of the sole. These spikes are commonly referred to as 1 inch and razor sharp. They weren't. They were only about 1/4 inch long. They were only modestly sharp because you didn't want to stick to the log. You wanted to be able to avoid falling off, but you didn't want to stick to it. So to dispel the rumor of the long, nasty spikes, that's what they looked like. When you got down to the sawmill, the rafts would be disassembled. They would be taken into the mill one at a time. They used circular saws and gang saws in the early days. A gang saw had several blades that moved up and down, and they would cut several boards at a time, but they didn't cut very fast. A faster way was to use a big circular saw, and the circular saw would only cut one board at a time, but it cut it quite rapidly. The saw mill tool here, this one may look a little familiar, was instead of having a 15-foot handle, the handle's been cut off to about 1 foot long. And if you notice what it looks like, this was actually made from an old pike pole that they simply cut the pushing end off of. This tool is used in the mill to grab the wood as it came off the saw and pull it out of the way. It's another picaroon. That about sums up the logging industry basically in Michigan. We actually cut more timber, more value in timber than all the gold in California by over $1 billion. Logging industry in Michigan cut enough pine by about 1900 to make over 10 million 6-room houses, to give you some idea of how big an industry it really was. In closing, I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope you got some good information out of this. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.